Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to speak with you today about the work that my colleagues and I have conducted in the United States and around the world over the last 45 years in developing, testing, and replicating a program of prenatal and early childhood home visiting known as nurse-family partnership. I think it's wise for Latvian leaders to consider investing in policies and programs to enhance the early health and development of children and families, given that children's and parents' success in life is shaped so profoundly by their experiences in pregnancy in the early years of the child's life. Nurse-family partnership is a program of prenatal and early childhood home visiting by nurses that begins as early in pregnancy as possible and follows families through child age 2. It focuses on mothers facing the adversities of poverty and who've had no previous live births. It's been tested in a series of randomized clinical trials with different populations living in different contexts, and found to produce replicated effects on outcomes of clear public health importance. One of the reasons the effects have been replicated is that the program is designed with clarity in nurses' goals and objectives and methods. The other, we believe, is that it activates and supports parents' instinctual drive to protect their children. Finally, it's grounded in strengths-based work. That is starting with what parents are doing well and caring relationships and deep respect for parents' efforts to cope with adversity. Nurse-family partnership nurses have three major goals. The first is to improve the outcomes of pregnancy by helping women improve their prenatal health. The second is to improve children's health and development. And the third is to improve parents' health and economic self-sufficiency. The program is grounded in three theories and developmental epidemiology. The program is grounded in attachment theory that focuses on our shared mammalian drive to protect our offspring. Critical to this series is parents' attunement and responding sensitively to the parents' communicative signals. Human ecology theory focuses on the role that social and material contexts play in shaping human behavior and opportunities. And self-efficacy theory, which focuses on how people develop adaptive behavior. It focuses on helping parents develop confidence and managing challenges in their lives. The program is also grounded in developmental epidemiology. That is, what research tells us are the specific parental behaviors or conditions in people's lives that undermine or support their health and development. This slide summarizes the overriding model that describes the program and how it's designed to affect health and development over the life course. Nurses focus on improving prenatal health and development, prenatal health-related behaviors that improve fetal development and health over the life course. They focus on the quality of parental care of the infant and toddler, which is thought to affect the child's neurodevelopmental integrity and future life chances. And maternal life course, which affects their abilities to care well for themselves and their children's health and development into late adolescence and later life course, including their neurodevelopmental functioning and later child health and adolescent development, including the avoidance of antisocial peers. All of this work is grounded in a commitment to clinical excellence, scientific integrity, and ongoing accountability as we move forward together. In the United States, we've developed and tested this program in 3 randomized clinical trials since 1977. First, in Elmira, New York, with a sample of primarily white families living in a semi-rural community. Then, in Memphis, Tennessee, with a sample of primarily Black families living in a major urban area. And then in Denver, Colorado, with a sample of that consisted of a large portion of Latino families. And in the Denver trial, we compared the relative effectiveness of the program when delivered by nurses versus paraprofessional visitors hired from the communities that they served. This slide shows the level of neighborhood adversity present among the participants in each of the 3 U.S. trials. The key message is that participants in the Elmira trial and the Denver trial lived in neighborhoods that were comparable to the average level of adversity found in U.S. communities nationwide. The Memphis participants, on the other hand, lived in communities that were 2.4 standard deviations above the national average in levels of adversity. This means that rates of crime and poverty in these neighborhoods were very high. Across the 3 trials, we found that there were replicated effects on at least 2 of the following outcomes on this slide. Improvements in prenatal health, especially reductions in prenatal tobacco use and hypertensive disorders of pregnancy. Reductions in children's injuries, and especially hospitalizations for injuries. Improvements in children's language and school readiness for mothers whose children were born to mothers with the fewest resources to cope with the adversities of living in deep poverty. There were reductions in children's behavioral problems, reductions in children's depression and anxiety, reductions in children's substance use, reductions in maternal behavioral impairment due to substance use, reductions in short subsequent pregnancy intervals, increases in maternal employment, and reductions in maternal reliance on cash assistance, welfare, and food stamps. Now I'm going to take you through each of the U.S. trials of the program. In the Elmira program, we registered 400 pregnant women with no previous live births who were registered before the 25th week of gestation. They were recruited on the basis of their being poor, unmarried, or young, and less than 19 years of age at registration. 89% were white, but 15% were of higher socioeconomic status, married, and non-adolescents, because we wanted to, we didn't want the program to be focused only on those in need. But as you'll see, the benefits of the program for this segment of the population were negligible. 48% of the women smoked 5 or more cigarettes per day at registration. And we completed assessments on 83% of the youth at age 19, and 81% of the mothers still alive at child age 15. Now I'm going to run through a series of slides that show the highlights of the Elmira trial. By child age 15, Nurse-visited low-income unmarried mothers reported fewer arrests than their counterparts in the control group. This is shown by the green bar here. The yellow bar shows the rates of arrest for women randomized to receive only prenatal home visiting. The rates of arrest for this group fell in between the control group and the group visited during pregnancy and infancy. This slide shows the rates of confirmed cases of child abuse and neglect in the control group, the group assigned to be visited by nurses during pregnancy only, and the group assigned to be visited during pregnancy and through child age 2. These differences in child abuse and neglect shown here for the sample as a whole were greater for families where there were greater sociodemographic risks at entry into the study. This slide shows the number of mothers' months between birth of the first and second child over the 15-year period following birth of the first child. Among mothers who were low socioeconomic status, that is poor, and unmarried, there were large differences in the timing of subsequent births among the group assigned to receive the full NFP program compared to those assigned to the control group. Nurse-visited vulnerable mothers were delaying the timing of their next birth. There were no NFP control differences for the sample as a whole. This slide shows the rates of self-reported arrests on the part of 19-year-old youth. The rates of arrests were significantly lower among those children born to mothers who received the full NFP program compared to those assigned to the control group. Those who received the program during pregnancy alone, their children had rates that fell in between the control group and the full NFP program delivered through child age 2. These differences were driven by particularly large effects in arrests before age 19 and for females, which I don't show here. Now I'm going to turn our attention to the design and results of our Memphis trial. We enrolled 1,138 pregnant women with no previous live births. And of these, we followed only 748 after delivery to reduce the cost of the study. 89% were Black, 85% were living below the U.S. federal poverty level. That is very poor at that period in U.S. history. And living in neighborhoods with very high levels of adversity, as I indicated earlier. Note that we have conducted assessments on 90% of the randomized youth who were still alive at age 18 and 85% of the mothers who were still alive. This slide shows the number of days that children were hospitalized with injuries in the first 2 years of life in the control group and the nurse-visited group. As you can see, there were large reductions in the days hospitalized with injuries or ingestions for the children whose mothers were assigned to receive NFP. The control group children's hospitalizations included head trauma, fractured long bones, fractured skulls, subdural hematomas, that is bleeding under the skull, and suspected child abuse and neglect. This slide shows that the effect of the program on days hospitalized for injuries and ingestions was most pronounced among children whose mothers had the fewest psychological resources to cope with living in deep poverty. Mothers with low psychological resources also had higher rates of those who had low psychological resources. I'm going to go back here. had higher rates of depression and anxiety, limited intellectual functioning, and limited sense of control over the adversities in their lives. By the time the children were 18 years of age, those in the control group visited by a nurse were more likely to have graduated from high school with honors. And children born to mothers with low psychological resources had higher scores on a test of language spoken to them. And they had better scores on a test of math achievement. And by age 18, nurse-visited children born to mothers with low psychological resources had lower levels of government-classified disability. And nurse-visited mothers themselves were more likely to be married by the time their firstborn children were 18 years of age. In the Denver trial, we registered 735 pregnant women with no previous live births. 45% were Latina. 16% were Black. All qualified for Medicaid. That is government health insurance for the poor. That is, they had incomes less than 133% of the U.S. poverty level or no private insurance. 23% smoked cigarettes at registration. Remember that the Denver trial compared the effectiveness of the program when delivered by nurses versus paraprofessional visitors hired from the community. Overall, we found that nurses produced effects that were about twice as large as for those visited by paraprofessional visited families. Here are some specific outcomes. Nurse-visited mothers had greater reductions in urine cotinine. Cotinine is a biomarker for tobacco use over the course of pregnancy than women in the control group. Note that the group visited by paraprofessionals fell in between the control group and the group visited by nurses. A non-significant difference for the paraprofessional visited group. Here we see that nurse-visited children born to mothers with low psychological resources had low levels of language delay and at child age 21 months than their counterparts in the control group. And that the paraprofessional group had rates of language delay that were in between the control group and the group visited by nurses. This is a non-significant difference here. And here we see that nurse-visited mothers had longer delays between the birth of their first child and the first subsequent pregnancy than their counterparts in the control group. And again, the paraprofessional group had delays that were not as long as the nurse-visited group. And over the first 9 years of age, nurse-visited children born to mothers with low psychological resources had better sustained attention scores than did their counterparts in the control group. Again, paraprofessional visited children had sustained attention scores that fell in between the control group and the nurse-visited group. We've recently completed an analysis of maternal and child mortality over decades following birth of the first child among participants in each of the 3 U.S. trials. Death is an infrequently occurring event in these age ranges, but an earlier pattern of results in our Memphis trial suggested that the program may be reducing maternal and child mortality over the life course. For this analysis, we combined the Elmira and Denver trials because they serve populations with similar sociodemographic characteristics and analyzed the rates of mortality separately for Memphis and the combined in Elmira and Denver samples. And here we see that there were no significant differences in maternal death for all causes, but the pattern of results in the Memphis trial is what we had hypothesized, although the difference was not statistically significant. The nurse visited group shown here in blue, and the control group is shown in red. Note that the rates of survival in the combined Elmira and Denver trials were higher overall and closer to what we see in the Memphis nurse visited group. The trend is for the Memphis control group to die at more rapid rate than their control than the other groups. Here we see that the rate of maternal survival for external causes of death, that is due to suicide, injuries, and homicide, were better among the nurse visited mothers in both the Memphis trial and the Elmira trial, and the Elmira and Denver trials combined, although the differences were not significant for these contrasts by themselves. But when we combine these studies, summarizing across all three trials, the nurse-visited control group difference in survival was on the borderline of statistical significance with a p-value of 0.054. Here we see that there was a trend for nurse-visited children in Memphis to die less frequently for preventable causes than children in the control group. Preventable cause of mortality included sudden infant death syndrome, injuries, and homicide. At younger ages, this difference was statistically significant, but was reduced to a trend by one preventable death in the nurse-visited group at about child age 25. As you can see, there were no deaths for preventable causes in the nurse-visited group in Memphis until age 25. There were no differences for death for preventable causes in the Elmira and Denver trials, largely because these rates were so low, nearly identical to the national rates and the rates found in the Memphis nurse visited group. Given these findings, we set up a model for rigorous replication of the program in the US that focused on these functions: supporting organizational and community capacity to deliver the program well, developing a model for educating nurses that relies on extensive reading of the program materials, plus face-to-face learning that typically takes about a week to complete. This educational leadership team ensures that nurses and leaders who deliver the program and who consult with them to ensure high-quality program delivery. The articulation of the program in detailed visit-by-visit guidelines to be adapted to individual family needs. An electronic information system that guides nurses to use to record families' needs and their work with families. A commitment to continuous assessment of program performance and continuous quality improvement of program delivery. In the US, the program is operating in about 350 communities, and in 2020 served 58,000 families. In the meantime, we developed a model for rigorous international replication of the program. It focused on the following elements. First, we make no presumptions about whether the program would work well in new settings. We recognize that the program will need to be tested and adapted to ensure its feasibility and acceptability in new contexts. We call for the conduct of pre-tests and small-scale trials to or evaluations of the program to give us a sense of whether the program appears to be working in new contexts. We encourage the conduct of randomized clinical trials if the program is, if the population is sufficiently large and it's feasible to conduct a trial. We've relied on quasi-experimental studies in some contexts. Finally, together we need to have assurance that the program is being faithfully replicated as it's expanded in the new society. We've developed and evaluated the program in the following countries: the United Kingdom, where it's delivered in England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. It's operating in every community in mainland Scotland and about 80 communities in England. In Australia, it serves Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families in now 15 communities. In Canada, where it's operating in British Columbia and Ontario, and in many communities in those provinces. In Norway, the program is now expanding to new sites and preparing for a deeper evaluation. In Bulgaria, where it's serving Roma families in Sofia and Plovdiv, and American Indian, Alaskan Native communities in the US. It was developed and tested in the Netherlands, but not continued because the Netherlands decided not to develop and use an information system to monitor the program's implementation. And in Germany, it appears that there were insufficient resources to deliver the program fully with community health nurses or midwives. I'm going to share with you the results of randomized trials of the program in the Netherlands, England, and British Columbia. The German team is planning additional analyses of their data that I'll share with you when the analysis is complete. The Dutch randomized trial recruited 460 high-need participants identified through a two-stage selection process. They found that those assigned to the program compared to those in the control group had a reduction in prenatal cigarette use, an increase in breastfeeding, a decrease in intimate partner violence, including a reduction in the mother being both a perpetrator and a victim of violence, improvements in the home environments that support infant health and development, a reduction in child internalizing and externalizing behavioral problems, and a reduction in child abuse and neglect reports. And the British trial consisted of a large sample of 1,645 young women who were less than 20 years of age at registration. There were no program effects on prenatal smoking, birth weight, emergency department encounters, hospitalizations, or timing of subsequent pregnancies. There were significant improvements in children's school readiness and reading at ages 5 through 7. However, this study had excellent execution, but challenges with its design, as I've indicated in the commentary in the Lancet cited here. In a trial conducted in British Columbia, the investigators registered a sample of 730 disadvantaged girls and women who were 14 to 24 years of age. They found a significant reduction in the number of cigarettes smoked over the course of pregnancy among those who smoked at registration. And they also found a significant reduction in the rates of prenatal cannabis use over the course of pregnancy. There were no other program effects on reports of street drugs or other substances. Other reports of this study are in the pipeline. While we emphasize the importance of adhering to the program, to the model we've tested in randomized trials, we think the program as a constant work in progress. We have a responsibility to make this program better. For example, we've conducted research aimed at increasing participant retention and completed home visits. We've conducted research focused on giving nurses a new tool to observe and promote caregiver-child interaction known as dance and dance steps. We've developed and tested methods for nurses to use in addressing maternal depression and anxiety. And finally, we've conducted formative work for the evaluation of a version of the program for women with previous live births. We're about to conduct a randomized trial of the program for those who've had previous live births. And finally, I'd like to share with you this African proverb. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Thank you.